All right, AP History. By the time you're watching this video, it should be Friday, and we're getting to the end of the week, and I know I'm excited for the weekend, and I hope you guys are too. We're coming to the end of Unit 3.1, and I want to wrap this up with a few big ideas and kind of summarize what we've covered. And get you set up to study for some tests next week. Now, I'm going to come back on Monday. I'll have another short video where I go over some study tips and some short answer questions, or at least the format. So you will see me again on Monday before we get to the assessments on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. For Unit 3.1, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through a few things on Canvas, highlight some big ideas, and show you a few last minute things that I want to say. For Unit 3.1, so far, we've been working our way through all this stuff. We did a discussion board post on how the French and Indian War changed things. We looked at some maps. We read this article about Pontiac's Rebellion. And I would definitely know the significance of the French and Indian War as a turning point in colonial relations, both, I would say, in terms of the Native Americans, but also in terms of taxes and the end of salutary neglect. So that was one big idea. I did a lecture on the road to revolution where we went through the acts, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townsend Act, so forth, T. And we talked about how the American desire for independence was not an all or nothing impulse, and it didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual drift. And even by the time you get to the Declaration of Independence, the majority of Americans were not necessarily revolutionaries. And that was something in the video notes from that lecture. Many students said, I didn't realize that most colonists were not for independence. You'll see statistics in a variety of places, but the one that I kind of fall back to is a third, and a third. About a third of colonists were for independence, about a third of colonists were not for independence, and about a third of colonists were kind of on the fence and could go either way, even in 1776. Things that maybe pushed people towards the tipping point would be things like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is right here. You can look through that, or the Declaration of Independence itself. This document, the Declaration of Independence, is a radical document that did move public opinion to follow it as much as it followed public opinion, if that makes sense. Let me see here. A few things about the Declaration of Independence that I would want you to know. I think three things. And there's lots more to that, but three that we'll stress. One, it's built off Enlightenment ideas. And so the famous phrase that I think many of you know starts right here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, it was John Locke who said life, liberty, and property are these fundamental rights, these inalienable rights. You're born with them naturally, and they're not supposed to be taken away. Of course, the irony, the hypocrisy, or the mystery of this Declaration of Independence is in this phrase, all men are created equal. What does that mean for people of color, for slaves? What does that mean for women? We know today that certainly they deserve, people of color and women deserve to be included in this enlightened ideal, even though our founding fathers, as many of you pointed out to me, were slaveholders and did not necessarily hold that broad a view of what this document was saying. So this document was built off Enlightenment ideas, but how far was it going to be able to go in that time period? A second thing I would point out about the Declaration of Independence is down here is this list of grievances is what this is called. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And what Jefferson and the people who worked with him on this are doing here is they're showing all the ways that the king has failed to answer their pleas for um, a redress of grievances. And this is important because, again, in the 1760s, the immediate cry of the colonists was not independence. It was, we like being English. We like being part of the empire. Please just respect our voice, our values, or things that are important to us. Now, over time, when these grievances have been refused, that's where there's going to be this movement towards independence. And some people got there sooner than others. And that's because it's hard to make that shift. Just to kind of give you an idea of how to get your mind into the loyalist mindset, think of something in your life that is super integral and that you're very dependent on. And then imagine just throwing that off and moving on to something new. So for me, let's say my phone. On my phone, I have had Verizon as a provider for tons of years. I've had, Apple iPhone for a long, long time. And on my device, I have all these apps that I've purchased and downloaded with my account. I've got all my photos and my online storage and all this stuff. Now, I'm not completely happy with Verizon or Apple or my iPhone. There are problems. And I have several people that tell me all the time, like, you should switch to AT&T or you should switch to Samsung. And there may be validity in those suggestions. But for me, to throw off something that I've had years of a relationship with and built up a dependency on, that's not an easy decision to just say, okay, I'm done with this and I'm moving on to something new. In many ways, that's how a lot of the loyalist colonists were. Like, they were clinging to the old way because they liked the old way. Yeah, it was mercantilism, but they knew where their sugar was coming from. They knew that they had the protection of the greatest navy in the world. They knew that British troops had supported them in the French and Indian War. So it was not an easy decision for colonists to move towards this independence idea. And it was only after all of these grievances have been failed to be received that a critical mass is starting to get towards an independent mind. And then finally, at the very end, the last line of the Declaration of Independence, it says, and for the support of this declaration, and with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. I think that's a powerful phrase, our lives. You have to understand, when these people sign this declaration and you've reached the tipping point, okay, we're going to war and we're going to fight for independence. In technical terms, this document is an act of treason. It's a radical document. Benjamin Franklin famously said, well, we're either going to hang separately or we're going to hang together. But what he's saying in that is, he was pleading for unity in the colonies, but what he's saying is this is treason. And if this doesn't work, we're going to get the death penalty. And so these guys and the people that follow them are really putting it all on the line for these Enlightenment ideals and for these beliefs. Declaration of Independence, super important, and it goes right alongside with common sense in terms of moving public opinion. Finally, the last thing I want to say, and I've already talked a bit more about those things than I wanted to, is interpreting the revolution. And this came up a lot in the crash course video, this idea of who won the American Revolution. And the cool thing about history is, depending on the facts that you choose to emphasize and depending on the values that you incorporate into your story, determines the narrative. So there's lots of ways that you can interpret the American Revolution. On this document, you see two different interpretations. These are secondary sources, 1950s, 1960s, of historians saying, well, this is what the revolution was about, a middle class idea, or the American Revolution from the bottom up. Two different interpretations saying this is what the American Revolution means. I think in the crash course, they talked about what the American Revolution accomplished for women, for people of color, for the lower class, and maybe more specifically what it didn't accomplish for them. Here's Abigail Adams in 1776. She's writing this letter to her husband, John Adams, and she says, I desire you would remember the ladies. And she's saying, these are things that are important to women. These are things that the American Revolution can mean and should mean for women. I at the end of all this, when the Constitution and the new American government is set up without the voice of women, I certainly think Abigail Adams is going to feel disappointed that the ladies were not remembered. Um, Here's another cool interpretation. This is Benjamin Rush. He says there's nothing more common than to confound the terms of the American Revolution with those of the late American War. Confound means to blend together or to treat as the same. He's saying that the Revolution is something altogether different than the War for Independence. The War for Independence meant one thing, but this American Revolution means another. And he says the war is over, but this is far from being the case with the revolution. There is a changing of the order, a changing of the way society works that is bigger than just the colonial relationship with Great Britain, but it's a broader revolution. That's a cool interpretation. Last thing on that, many people have sent me notes about Hamilton, Hamilton the musical, saying, "Oh yeah, I know some of this from that." I loved this article. This was from The Atlantic several years ago. How Lin-Manuel Miranda shapes history. It's actually an interview. That's just the introduction. The whole interview is here with that, and you can read it. But the recent Broadway play, Hamilton, is a great example of historical interpretation. The play portrays Hamilton as an immigrant from a bottom up, rags to riches story who's taking his shot to turn the world upside down. That is a cool interpretation, and it is based in some fact. As they tell the story on the stage, that they use people of color, they use African American actors and actresses, they use hip hop as a medium to communicate it. And some of that is right in line with the historical facts, and other parts are not. So as a matter of fact, Alexander Hamilton was not this great populist leader. Yes, he was an immigrant. Yes, he was against slavery, but in other respects, he was very much an elitist who looked to preserve the status quo for the wealthy, merchant class, the capitalist class. So there are parts of history that don't correspond with Hamilton the musical, even though all in all it's very good and a lot of fun. Okay, that's going to be it. I've gone too long again, but I will be back on Monday to show you some studying stuff. This is the stuff I'm going to show you when it comes to studying, and I'm also going to go over short answers, but I'll save that for next week. All right, thank you guys for listening. I hope you have a great weekend.